The rain had just stopped in Cebu City, leaving the streets slick and shimmering under flickering yellow lights. The smell of damp concrete mixed with fried fish and diesel smoke lingered in the air, wrapping itself around everything like a familiar blanket. People hurried past, clutching bags and umbrellas, eager to get home. No one noticed the boy sitting near the corner of Colon Street, his back against a cracked wall, a small plastic cup in front of him. His name was Mateo. He looked no older than 13, though life had carved deeper lines into his eyes than most adults carried. His shirt was faded, hanging loosely on his thin frame, and his slippers were worn almost flat. But when he lifted his head and opened his mouth to sing, everything about him changed. That night, he wasn't singing for coins. He was singing because the silence felt heavier than hunger. Wise men say. The first note came out soft, almost hesitant, like he was testing whether the world was ready to listen. A couple walking by slowed down. A jeepney driver leaned out of his window. Mateo closed his eyes, and suddenly, the cracked street became a stage only he could see. Only fools rush in. His voice wasn't just good, it was haunting. Deep, rich, filled with a kind of longing that didn't belong to a child. It carried pain, hope, and something else, something impossible to ignore. People began to gather. Some stood with arms crossed, curious. Others pulled out their phones. A small crowd formed, their conversations fading as Mateo's voice rose into the humid night. But I can't help falling in love with you. A woman wiped tears from her eyes. A street vendor stopped mid-sale, her hands frozen as she listened. Even the stray dogs seemed to settle down, as if they too understood that something rare was happening. When Mateo finished, the silence lasted for a heartbeat too long, then the applause came crashing in. Coins clinked into his cup. Someone dropped a folded bill. A man in a white shirt stepped forward, clapping slower than the others, his gaze fixed on the boy. You ever thought of auditioning? The man asked. Mateo blinked, unsure. Auditioning for what, sir? For a show, the man said, smiling. Ireland's Got Talent. They're holding international auditions this year. I work with a production team. The words sounded unreal, like something from a dream Mateo had never dared to have. I don't have money, Mateo said quietly. The man shook his head. You don't need money, you just need that voice. Mateo looked down at his cup, then back at the man. For years, the streets had taught him one thing. Nothing comes for free. Why me? He asked. The man's smile softened. Because I've been in this business for 20 years, and I've never heard anything like you. Weeks later, Mateo stood in an airport for the first time in his life. The noise was overwhelming. Announcements, rolling suitcases, voices in languages he couldn't understand. He clutched the small backpack someone had given him, his only possession besides the clothes he wore. Everything felt too big, too fast, but when he closed his eyes, he could still hear the streets of Cebu. And he remembered why he was here. The flight was long. Mateo barely slept. He stared out the window as clouds stretched endlessly beneath him, wondering if his life was really changing, or if he'd wake up back on the sidewalk. When they landed in Dublin, the air was cold and sharp, biting through his thin jacket. He shivered but said nothing. The production team guided him through the city, past buildings that looked like they belonged in another century. Everything felt like a different world. Finally, they arrived at the theater. Ireland's Got Talent. Mateo stood backstage, his heart pounding so loudly he thought it might echo through the halls. Performers rushed around him. Dancers stretching, singers warming up, magicians practicing tricks. He felt small, invisible. What am I doing here? He whispered to himself. A woman from the crew knelt beside him. You're here because you deserve to be, she said gently. Mateo nodded, though doubt still clung to him like a shadow. When his name was called, time seemed to slow. He walked onto the stage, the bright lights blinding him for a moment. The audience stretched out before him, a sea of faces. At the judges' table sat the people he'd only seen on borrowed phones back in Cebu. And in the center was Simon Cowell. Mateo swallowed hard. Hello, Simon said, his voice calm but curious. What's your name? Mateo, sir. And where are you from? Mateo. Cebu, Philippines. There was a murmur in the audience. That's quite far, Simon said. How old are you? 13. Simon raised an eyebrow. All right, and what are you going to sing today? Mateo hesitated. For a second, the fear threatened to take over. Then he remembered the nights on the street, the hunger, the loneliness, and the way music had always carried him through. An Elvis song, sir. Simon leaned back slightly, intrigued. Okay, let's hear it. The music began. For a brief moment, Mateo's voice caught in his throat. The stage felt too big, the audience too silent. Then he closed his eyes. Wise men say. The transformation was instant. The nervous boy disappeared, replaced by something powerful, something undeniable. His voice filled the theater, rich and soulful, echoing off the walls. The audience leaned forward. Only fools rush in. Simon's expression changed. The slight skepticism melted into surprise, then something deeper. But I can't help falling in love with you. Mateo sang like he was back on the streets, like the world didn't exist beyond his voice. Every note carried emotion, every word felt lived in, real. A judge placed her hand over her mouth. The audience sat in stunned silence. When he reached the final note, he held it just long enough to make it unforgettable, then let it fade into the quiet. For a split second, no one moved. Then the theater erupted. The applause was deafening. People stood, clapping, cheering. Some wiped tears from their eyes. Mateo opened his eyes, overwhelmed. Simon didn't clap right away. He just stared. Finally, he leaned forward, resting his hands on the table. Mateo, he said slowly, that was not what I was expecting. A nervous laugh rippled through the audience. Simon continued, I've heard that song 1,000 times. But I've never heard it like that. Mateo felt his chest tighten. You don't just sing, Simon said. You feel, and that's something you can't teach. The other judges nodded in agreement. You have something very, very special, Simon added. And I think this is just the beginning for you. The crowd cheered again. Let's vote, Simon said. One by one, the judges gave their answers. Yes, yes, that's a yes from me. Mateo's heart raced. Simon paused, then smiled slightly. It's a yes from me. The audience exploded once more. Mateo covered his mouth, tears spilling down his cheeks. For the first time in his life, they weren't tears of sadness. They were something else, hope. Backstage, everything felt unreal. People congratulated him. Cameras followed him, and for a moment, Mateo didn't know where to look or what to say. The same boy who had once been invisible on the streets was now being seen, truly seen. That night, as he lay in a small hotel room, he stared at the ceiling, unable to sleep. He thought about Cebu. He thought about the nights he'd gone to bed hungry, the days he'd sung just to survive. And he thought about the moment on stage, when the fear disappeared, and all that remained was his voice. For the first time, he allowed himself to imagine a different future. Not just survival, something more. Weeks passed, and Mateo continued through the competition. Each performance revealed more of his talent, more of his story. The audience fell in love with him, not just for his voice, but for his heart. Simon watched closely. There was something about Mateo that stayed with him. It wasn't just the talent. It was the honesty, the rawness, the way he made people feel. During one rehearsal, Simon approached him. You know, he said, this competition could change your life. Mateo nodded. I know, sir. But win or lose, Simon continued, what matters is what you do after this. Mateo looked at him, listening carefully. You have a gift, Simon said. Don't waste it. Mateo smiled softly. I won't. The final performance arrived. The theater was packed. The stakes were higher than ever. Mateo stood backstage, his hands trembling slightly. But this time, the fear felt different. It wasn't overwhelming. It was energy. When he stepped onto the stage, the applause welcomed him like an old friend. He looked at the audience, then at the judges. And for a moment, he thought about the boy sitting on a wet street in Cebu, singing to passers-by who barely noticed. Then he began to sing. This time, it wasn't just about proving himself. It was about telling his story. Every note carried everything he had been, and everything he hoped to become. When he finished, the silence was even deeper than before. And then, just like that first night on Colin Street, the world erupted. No matter the outcome, one thing was certain. Mateo was no longer invisible. From the streets of Cebu to the stage of Ireland's Got Talent, his voice had carried him across oceans, across doubt, across impossible odds. And as Simon Cowell sat there, still slightly stunned, one thought lingered in his mind. Sometimes, the greatest talent doesn't come from training or privilege. Sometimes, it comes from the places the world forgets to look. And when it finally steps into the light, it changes everything.